Well, I think if you start from the very beginning, our family isn't conventional at all. There's nothing conventional about her being born into a family where both parents were world leaders and premiers of this country, so that in itself is unconventional. She had a very unconventional upbringing. Um, I'm not really even sure my mother knows what it means to conform to convention because that wasn't ever required of her. She was very fortunate having been born into a illustrious family, but also living in the public eye, that I don't think it was ever expected of her. For a woman who was from a very conservative background, my grandmother never expected her daughters to conform to convention. She never interfered with who they married or what choices they made in terms of where they studied and what they studied. So convention was never really part of her upbringing or her vocabulary. So from our perspective, for my sister and I, again, I suppose it was never something that we were expected to conform to, you know? We're the products of a marriage between a politician and a marriage between an actor-turned-politician. Neither of my parents were conventional. They were ahead of their time in many ways. They were different in many ways. So therefore, our childhoods were not conventional either. I mean, in some ways, particularly as adolescents, as older teenagers, I suppose you can say there were some negatives about that because it's not conventional having a single parent who is also very absent. And as much as she tried, she was often very absent in our teenage years. So we sort of had to kind of muddle through and find our own way. But as a result of which also, I think we were also spared this sort of helicopter parenting of our generation. Many of my friends and contemporaries had parents, particularly mothers, who were over-interfering and over-involved, and we never experienced that. Firstly, because of the simple act that she wasn't present. Secondly, because that's just not her personality to interfere. She isn't the kind of person who expects a certain performance or expects us to, you know, reach top marks. We set those standards for ourselves, but she was unconventional in that way as a mother. And I think that translates a lot to the way she found her own way of leading as a politician. You know, she was different in the way that, I suppose, first of all, she was a woman executive, and for decades prior to her entering active politics, Sri Lanka hadn't had women in strong positions of leadership, well, since my grandmother, really. And we're talking about periods of quite autocratic, almost dictatorial rule, I suppose, in the late 1970s, 80s, early 90s, the presidents we had, the leaders we had. So she came in with a storm. She came in with something very different that she was offering as a result of her not conforming. I think her approach politically was always to try and recruit the best people for the job, and in a very similar way to the way she parents, not set too high pressures or standards, but give them the opportunity to blossom and perform. She shows her disappointments in certain ways if you don't hit the targets that you need to hit, but I think that was, in a way, very unconventional for the time. It was forward-thinking, it was groundbreaking, really, in Sri Lankan politics. She led in a very different way. And I wonder if maybe that also meant that she was respected for that in a different way. Maybe at the beginning, particularly the civil servants that she would have had to work with would have found her approach incredibly difficult and unconventional because she was so liberal and open-minded, and her approach was sort of more lateral thinking. But I think once they sussed her out and once they sussed out how she was working, I think maybe that was also an interesting approach for them. So yeah, we would see that her politics reflecting life, her life reflecting politics, and I think that's been very much a common thread throughout her life, and I suppose there's no other way that she knows any different because she was born into that, and this has always been such a big part of her life.